Brian Maynard says Appalachian Train for the win, or Trail for the win.
I'm on the PCT side, so Appalachian Trails. It's a long trail on the East Coast. Over here on the West Coast, the one that most people do, and when I say most people, I mean the people who can take 6 months off from life. So you hike from Mexico, or right on the United States border at Mexico, called the Southern Terminus, all the way up into Washington, and the Northern Terminus, I believe, is in Canada. So in order to really complete it, you do need to have a passport. But it takes like 6 months on average for most people. And who's got that kind of time?
Wow.
I mean, it's got to be people that are retired or people that don't have kids yet, maybe in their 20s, and maybe they don't have a career yet, so they just saved up, all their waitressing money. And I say that because that's what a lot of people do. They work at REI, they're waitresses, that type of stuff. So they just save up a ton of money and then they go do it.
Wow. Ron says his son starts the PCT on April 24th, 5 months, and can't cross the trail now into Canada. Wow. Jeez, that's
and it's going to be problematic this year because of the amount of snow we've had in the Sierras. A lot of people do what's called the JMT, the John Muir Trail, and it's only 200 something miles, whereas the PCT I think is like 2,500. So the JMT you can do in about 2 to 3 weeks, maybe 2 to 4 weeks, depending upon how ambitious you are per day on the number of miles you're going to do. So it used to be you could start in June. May would be dicey, but June would be mostly okay as long as you're skilled. But the snow is so high right now that they don't think it's going to melt in time, and the river crossings are going to be just roaring, and you just unsafe to cross. Because as the snow is melting, all that water gets put into the rivers, and it just is roaring. So
I've seen Into the Wild. I know how that ends.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Eating berries in a bus somewhere, praying for, nope, no thanks, nope. Well, although I gotta imagine, I guess so through the U.S., there must be parts on the trail where you can call for help, or there's so many other people who pass by.
There's a lot of people, and there's parts where you can exit the trail at least and get help. But for the most part, I guess as you're coming through San Diego County, that you're gonna be pretty close to, help. But some places, you're really far from help. But there are places you can exit the trail for help.
Man.
And some people carry, devices, in-reach GPS devices that can send a satellite text out for, SOS.
Really, really hungry.
Yeah. Well, in the past couple of years with the drought being so bad, people were exiting in San Diego County, which is, unheard of for PCT hikers because that's too early. And it's because we had no water, so, maybe they were looking at really old data where, 2010 or earlier, we had a lot of water, but for the past few years, people have been relying on what we call trail ferries to drop water out in the middle of nowhere so that people can fill up and not have to rely on natural sources.
Wow. Well, enough of that. I don't want anything to do with that. I'm not subscribed. Let's see, we'll go ahead and start tackling some of the questions here. Richard Seltzer asks, I've read that you shouldn't mess with preferred and possible owners for availability group roles in Failover Cluster Manager, since SQL Server dynamically sets those. But what about the failover and failback settings, like max number of failovers per period, prevent and allow failback? Can I set to those other than the default, and if so, what should I set them to? Have you ever touched that?
I don't really touch anything in Failover Cluster Manager if it's an availability group. All of my config goes into the availability group in Management Studio or T-SQL commands. But Failover Cluster Manager, I can't really think of anything except for checking the status of, say, the listener, that type of thing, just so you're looking for red-green type stuff.
I get where you're going with the prevent, allow, failback stuff, Richard, but yeah, I wouldn't ever touch those either. I would just let, failbacks aren't going to happen automatically anyway. Once an AG is running on a node, it's just going to keep running on a node. It's not going to come back by default as soon as the primary owner comes back up. I can't think of a scenario where I'd want to touch those. That's a really good question for Stack Exchange, though. If you go to dba.stackexchange.com and post that, because I bet people do have reasons for changing it. I just can't think of any where I'd want to change away from the defaults. Kyle says, we have a server with one specific Xeon processor. It has 22 cores and 22 cores and 44 threads. He has hyper-threading turned on. Dude, I don't know if you're trying to set some kind of licensing record on how much you pay for a single processor, but that is a lot of freaking money. This also means that there's 11 cores per NUMA node. SP Blitz reports that node 0 has 11 cores. This is a really bad NUMA configuration. This is how the chip should be spec'd. Should we be concerned? I would not run SQL Server on that. At Enterprise Edition, that's $7,000 a core. Standard Edition, it's $2,000 a core. But either way, that is a ton of licensing. And if you really need that many CPU cores, you probably need more than one socket. And I'd rather have multiple sockets broken up that way. I would want to know more about what the chip choice was with that. Let's see here. Next up, JH says, would performance be the same if I created after insert triggers dumping into a history table, or as opposed to having my T-SQL insert statement process that? He says, I'm doing it like 100 times a day. What's the best way to capture changes, with a trigger or by changing my code?
I'm not seeing these questions in my list.
Oh, man. You're setting up as an organizer. Well, so JH, what my thing is, if it's only 100 inserts per day, it shouldn't be that much of a bottleneck. I mean, that's only, what, 4 times an hour, 5 times an hour? It shouldn't be too bad. And if it's only run that often, I'm kind of okay with it being in a trigger, just because that way it's only one place to change the logic and you're done. If it's 100 times a second, then things start to get more interesting. But at 100 times a day, don't worry about it. Brian says, I haven't made it through the always-on availability groups in the HADR module on your site. Well, get to work, Brian. Come on. What are you doing? But I wanted to ask if you could recommend a site that would have a compilation of various always-on failure scenarios. Oh, what a great question. Stack Exchange. Go to dba.stackexchange.com, search for always-on, one word, no spaces, grammatically incorrect, but that's how they've tagged it over there. You will find a spectacular amount of failure scenarios there.
I attended a session in past 2014. I forget who it was, but it was someone from Microsoft put it on that went over the most common issues and what the resolutions were, and how to monitor. It was a really nice session. I think he said that it was supposed to be like a half-day session because there's just so many problems, but he condensed it to the most common ones, and had an hour session of it.
Man, if any of you ever get the chance to go to major conferences and you get the chance to see someone at Microsoft present about always-on availability groups, I would totally do it, because they have a lot of really good presenters and a lot of really good presentations too. Brian asks another question. Is there a good, cheap place for developers to work with cloud-based Windows virtualization, such as Google Cloud or Azure? The catch with machines up in the cloud is that there's no difference between production and development. It's the same price essentially to the provider, whether you're using it for production work or development. So when you talk about cheap stuff in the cloud, that gets a little bit trickier. What you could play with if you just want to experiment with someone else's VM is search for the Microsoft Virtual Labs. Microsoft has a bunch of VMs that you can spin up and use for, I want to say it's like 2 hours at a time, and they're free. You can't copy paste. There's some other limitations, yada, yada, yada. Oh, Guillermo asks, have you ever partitioned a table in a third-party vendor app without consulting the vendor about it first? Are there any possible issues with implementing partitioning without breaking the app? Tara, is that something that you would go do?
Never.
And
the
why
most
not?
I do in vendor databases is maybe create indexes, update statistics, that type of stuff. But yeah, I don't touch things, because a lot of times it's going to violate your contract, and if they see that you've messed with things, that could cause some problems for you.
Mm-hmm.
What are you trying to solve, though? I wonder, are you is it for performance, or are you just trying to delete, get rid of data easier, faster? I wonder what you're trying to solve here.
Yeah, you can totally break apps by doing that, absolutely. Man, I've done stuff like that. Even just adding an index, I broke somebody's app because they did a deployment script and they were renaming things, renaming indexes, and they chose an index name that happened to be the same as what I was using, and their script broke. Oh, it's a bad day. Oh, Robert asks, how do you feel, wonderful, about multi-subnet clustering with AGs? I have one machine in one location and another machine in another subnet. Tara, how do you feel about that?
Love it.
Love it, yes.
I love everything about availability groups. But yeah, at the companies I've worked with, they've all had disaster recovery requirements. So when we deployed availability groups, all of our availability groups were multi-subnet configurations. The only issue is maybe legacy applications can't use the multi-subnet failover equal true connection parameter. So you want to make sure you have database drivers that can. Otherwise, you might have issues connecting at times. You have 50% failure rate. There are some ways to work around it. My last client was able to work around that issue because they had a lot, I think like hundreds of legacy applications, and one of the workarounds did work for them. And as I was talking to them, I said, none of these workarounds worked at my previous companies, and they're like, oh yeah, it worked for us. I was like, oh, finally a success on one of those workarounds. We tried them all.
He says, is the main pain point for it the network setup and possibly latency between the sites if it's not done right? What would you describe as like pain points that you would worry about?
I don't really have any pain points with the multi-subnet configuration. As long as your application can use that connection parameter, it's only going to connect to the active site anyway. That's because you'll have 2 IP addresses, and only one of those IP addresses will be active. So there isn't a performance issue. There isn't a performance issue between the 2. However, if you've set up your replicas to be synchronous across the disaster recovery due to your other site, now that's where performance can certainly have problems due to the network latency. But that's not really relevant to the multi-subnet configuration question. It's related, but not relevant.
And did you guys use synchronous replication between multiple subnets, or did you just use it for async like DRs type stuff?
So almost entirely, it was all synchronous at the primary site and then asynchronous to another site. However, there was one application that we were able to get away with synchronous between the primary and the DR site, which were probably like 200, 300 miles away. And it's because that system, that application had such low throughput, it didn't matter. It was very, very small transactions, and the network latency, whatever it is, 15 milliseconds, just wasn't noticeable enough. So we wanted to limit how many replicas we had. And so it made sense for that specific database to be synchronous across sites. But other than that, synchronous is terrible across. You want to stay away from that if performance matters.
Yes. Reese says, we're finally setting up backup and restores to a new database server for verifying them. We should have done this a long time ago. If the database is production, is it legal to restore them on a developer edition for the purpose of verification only, or do we need to buy another standard edition license to be compliant? So this is tricky. What I would say is you should have a development server that you restore to every day that your developers can go run queries and tests against it. And then that way you've accomplished the goal that you're looking to accomplish, and it's still just a developer edition server. But if you
I was going to ask that question because I've been asking questions about this this week, and I was wondering because I had systems where I restored a developer database because they needed access to production data, and it could be older, and so they developed against it, and we ran CheckDB there. So I was like, was I supposed to license that with production licenses? And we did have MSDN licenses for those developers, so they were covered there.
The trick is CheckDB. As soon as you offload CheckDB, if you're not doing it in production and you are doing it on this other server, then suddenly that's magically much more like offloading production workload. That's a little trickier. Tom says, is it a good idea to set auto-create statistics to on for TempDB? I realize that it's already defaulted to on for model, so we think TempDB gets these settings from model where it's created each time it's restarted. Yeah.
I've never even changed TempDB setting like that, and you notice it for model. Why aren't you able to check it for TempDB? Just right-click on the database and see is it on. So
yeah, it's already on.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should be on. And is it a good idea to leave it on? Yes. Yeah. Bobby says, we have a data warehouse on SQL Server 2008 R2, and users are allowed to run ad hoc queries against it. When a query's been running for a long time, meaning hours, we can usually tune it. However, we don't have a systematic approach to identifying long-running queries. Is there a low overhead way to gather the most long-running queries that users are running?
Have you heard of us? We have the blitzes. Use SB Blitz Cache to figure out what your long-running queries are. You can sort it by average duration, average CPU. There's all sorts of things you could sort the plan cache by, and Blitz Cache can help you do that work, and it gives you all sorts of neat warnings that have been worked into it, the execution plan, so much wealth of data returned from Blitz Cache. Use that, And then, also use SP Blitz index for help with adding, high value missing indexes that maybe you didn't uncover by looking at execution plans.
You don't have to install anything other than the stored procedure, just works immediately, and it makes you look like a rock star consultant, more like her, less like me.
And they're very lightweight. On servers where we're running on, you won't even notice a hit when these things are running, and they may run for several minutes depending upon how big your plan cache, the complexity of your execution plans are. But it's not going to be a noticeable load added to your system while it's running.
Ben says, Tara sounds so proud, like it's her new Blitz baby.
Oh, no, God, no. That's not me. That's
that
Eric.
Would be Eric, darling, yes.
I one time modified code for SP Blitz, and it's probably been about 3 or 4 months. It's like, I don't know if I ever want to do that again.
I am constantly amazed that people contribute code, because sometimes I'll go into a stored proc I haven't seen for a while, and I'm like, oh, God. Oh,
you don't even know where to go, and you're trying to follow the logic, and
it's
tough.
huge.
And then GitHub's just tough also.
Yes. GitHub it took me years to get used to GitHub. Jeremiah was always pushing that on me. I'm like, no, it's evil, it's awful. Mike asks a question that I think is custom written for Tara here. We have heard that always-on replication is much better for replication than regular SQL replication. Is that the case, and why?
I'm confused by the question. Always-on replication?
When you choose between always-on and, say, transactional replication, which is better under which circumstances?
So they're asking about a readable secondary as compared to using transactional replication? Okay. I mean, I prefer availability groups for readable secondary. So I supported transactional replication for years and years to offload select queries to another system to avoid blocking issues. Even with RCSI in place, we were having issues. So we offloaded work, and when availability groups got announced, and I realized it was going to be HADR plus readable secondaries, I was like, yes, finally. My whole goal was to get rid of transactional replication, but it was nice to also be able to consolidate the number of features we were using down to just one. So when you'll use transactional replication as compared to a readable secondary availability group, that's going to be dependent upon, so if your database, your reporting database can be identical to your OLTP database, then you can use availability groups. If you need additional indexes added to your reporting database, you will have to add those to your OLTP database because it's an exact copy of your database. Transactional replication, so you can add objects, you can have different indexes, you can have lots of, it could be hosting the database for another application, and you're just replicating a few extra tables over to it. So it just depends on what that reporting database is going to look like. Can it be a copy of your production database, or is it going to be different?
Graham says, we have SSDs that host the data and log files for our various servers. I think the SSD drives are overwhelming the 10 gig NICs on some of our servers. We're experiencing query timeouts, but the server team isn't convinced that it's the NICs. What should I look at? I would just run a load test straight against from the SQL Server to those solid-state drives, run a load test, and have your network team look at network utilization during that time. It should be very easy for them to monitor switch port utilization. And then if they say, oh, there's more headroom, you could get more through it, have them do more things, like give you more solid-state drives to test against, and then you should be able to see that thing go up. Generally speaking, I don't see switch port utilization monitoring done full-time. It's something that people only drop in periodically and go look at, because I haven't seen a lot of good monitoring apps that can trend that over time.
And just to add, he's mentioning experiencing query timeouts, then going into all this SSD and network stuff. As like, that's not where I would be starting. I would be looking. I would be capturing activity via SP who is active on a regular basis, and then going back and looking at what queries did timeout, maybe the ones that took 30 seconds, 31 seconds, whatever your application query timeout is, and seeing what those queries were waiting on. Start logging activity every 30 seconds, every 60 seconds, maybe even more frequently, so you can catch more. But just be careful with how much you're going to be looking at and the retention of that. But I wouldn't be looking at these things first. I'd be looking at what are the queries waiting on, and that's going to tell me where I'm going to go next.
Guillermo asks a follow-up to his partitioning question. He says, regarding third-party apps and partitioning their tables, the reason I asked is to improve index maintenance on very large tables. So if you wanted to improve index maintenance, what would you do?
I would disable the jobs. I get rid of it.
They seem to run a lot
I
faster
would
now.
only be looking at really update statistics, and is that helpful with table partitioning? And how long is that taking? As far as index maintenance, I mean, what are you trying to prove? Are you trying to run it daily and have less locking? I just don't think that index maintenance is too important. I'm of the opinion maybe run it monthly, quarterly, run update statistics daily, but the other stuff less frequently. It just isn't really needed.
It's one of those things where I notice people are like, you also have to know it's hitting your transaction log, so you're scrambling all this data, doing all these writes. Even if you're only doing a portion of the table, you're still writing a ton of data there. And if the table's big enough to be partitioned, you probably have years worth of history inside there. How much do you really want to go scrambling that data all the time? JH asks, an add-on to my earlier trigger question, would performance be the same if the inserts were much higher, like 100 times a second for triggers versus inserts? This is where you just have to look at, for example, the logic that's going into the insert table, the transaction volume of other things hitting the same table at the same time. If my application is able to do the change in one statement and make a log to an editing or a logging history table, I might even say that logging history table may not even be in the same database or on the same server. I may have a really crappy history server where I go just dump things like logs that I'm not as urgent with. I have one client, for example, that goes to try to get 50,000 inserts per second into a table. So they do their inserts in one table and logging any changes that they do over in a totally separate environment. It's not even SQL Server. Prakash says, how do I avoid deadlocks due to a clustered index on a table? I have multiple sessions that are inserting records at the same time, and I'm seeing deadlocks. Ooh, that's kind of a trick question there.
Maybe the clustered index key needs to be changed so that you don't have the hotspot. Because can't an identity column that has a hotspot? I know we don't really concern ourselves with hotspots as much. Like on SQL Server 6.5, hotspot was like the thing we always talked about. But do we talk about that much anymore? I would wonder what the key is on.
Yeah, well, I also want to see that. I would want to see the deadlock graphs.
I don't want to see that.
I don't. That's a good point.
I can't read those darn things.
Neither of us really want to see it. Conceptually, we want to.
Send it to Jonathan Cahias. He loves looking at those things.
Posted on, I want to say it's SQLServerPerformance.com or is it SQLPerformance.com, and Cahias answers questions on there. You can include the deadlock graphs. But I have a very strong hunch that there's other tables involved or other indexes involved in that, not just the clustered index. So let's see here. Ben says, I'm looking for good ways to investigate resource semaphore weights. And also he wants to know if there's a way to push something through when that is the weight type. Tara, have you played around with this weight type, and if you're facing it, where do you go look to identify more?
I have to look it up every single time because I can't remember. Because I haven't experienced it in the wild, so this stuff is all new. All these poison weights that we see with our clients, I've never experienced these, so I don't have these quite memorized. I know that this one's the severe memory pressure, right? This is a really bad memory pressure issue. Pushing something through, I wonder if maybe he's referring to when resource semaphore occurs. Is it like the denial of service that you see with Threadpool?
It's a lot like it, except it's memory instead of worker threads.
Okay.
So queries
what errors do they start getting?
You get no errors at all. The queries can still pile up on worker threads, but you do see resource semaphore as weight type. What you need to do is, and Eric actually improved SP Blitz Cache because we started running into this a lot at one period in time. With SP Blitz Cache, there's a sort by memory grant. So you can sort by memory grant to see which queries are getting granted the most memory and then go tune them so that they don't ask for ungodly amounts of RAM. Maybe it's query tuning, maybe it's index tuning, it's different in every case, but that's how you go about tuning those queries. Is there a way to push something through? Yeah, make it use less memory. Change the plan so that it only needs a tiny amount of memory to get through instead of gigabytes. Prakash asks, how do I find out what license type and the number of licenses I have on an existing instance? Who shall play the sad trombone for him? There is no way of knowing. You have to go to the accounting department. Sadly, so SQL Server doesn't have a key that you have to put in. Up until 2016, they started asking for the key, but before that, you could, install Enterprise Edition without being licensed for it. That's why we hired Tara to get her out of a program, because she had put in, thousands of instances of Enterprise Edition without paying, so we had to get her out. Stop installing that. Let's see here. David says, "Hi, first time with you live, as opposed to when we're dead," and he's enjoying the catch-up shows. Here's my question. Years ago, I created a script that added indexes for foreign keys. That's kind of cool.
I love it. Like it so far.
you should start a blog and share that, because people would get excited about that. Lots of people like doing that. He says, "Now, after running SP Blitz Index, I find most of these are not used. So before I delete them, what's my opinion on creating indexes for foreign keys in order to aid joins?"
When I'm creating a new database and it's ready to go to production, I want all my foreign keys to be indexed, just as a starting point, because those are usually the columns that we're going to be joining on. Now, if they end up not being used, I would wait, write down when your last server restart was, wait, a couple weeks, 4 weeks. You need some kind of, you need a lot of workload to occur, and then look at the unused indexes, and then make decisions based upon that. I always tell this to my clients. I dropped an index on a Tuesday about 10 years ago on a 7 terabyte mission critical database, and on a Saturday I got called by our NOC. CPU had been at 100% for about an hour before they called me, and I logged in. Sure enough, CPU is still high. I ran a query to check who's using the most CPU. And the query that was doing it, its where clause matched exactly that index I had dropped. I had dropped that index 2 weeks after we had last restarted the servers. We did the Microsoft security patches monthly. And it turns out there was a query that would run on the first of every month, and that query, the first of the month, was not included in my workload when I checked that report. So we ended up moving that query to another system anyway, because it didn't need to run on production on real-time data. But it's really important when you look at the unused indexes that you know how long your system's been up and what your workload is. Do you have weekly queries, monthly queries? So make sure you have some uptime.
Yeah. I think we'd all agree it's a good starter practice. Like when you don't know anything about a database, it's a nice place to start. Guillermo asks, any upcoming deals on Brent Ozar training? We tend to run a few sales a year. One of them is our Black Friday sale in November, but one of the other ones we run is the company's anniversary sale in May. So in May we'll run a deal. I don't know what the deal is yet. For years it was, when we had our first year, we gave people 10% off, 2 years, 20%, 3 years, 30%. Even up to 5 years last year was 50% off. I'm just guessing it'll probably be 60% off at our 6th birthday in May. It'll only be on the online stuff, though, not in the in-person training. Deborah says, can you help me understand index space usage? Yes. I have a table with a primary key. SSMS indicates it a certain size, and index space is a certain size. So I add 2 more indexes, and the index space is higher. Next, I rebuild something, and the index respace even. So let me boil down your question, say it a different way. Why, when I rebuild an index, would it get larger?
Fill factor is the only thing I can think of, so you've got a lower fill factor.
Yes.
So maybe your fill factor server setting has changed to a lower value and you weren't expecting that, or maybe you are using the lower fill factor than 100%. So look at your fill factor for that index.
And where do they find a fill factor?
For the index, just go to the properties of that index. And then at the server setting, go to, you right-click on the server in SSMS, and I think it's the database settings. It's in there. Chiranjeevi, I believe I'm saying his name completely incorrectly, keeps sending in messages about how to see licensing. Unfortunately, that's just the number of sockets and cores you have, not how many you're licensed for. That's the problem there. I can go set up an 80-core server, and yes, I have 80 cores. That doesn't mean I magically made $560,000 worth of licensing appear from the darkness. Tom says, is it possible to have too many statistics? Yes. So what are the problems when you have a boatload of statistics? I don't know, keeping them up to date.
Yes. Yes. SQL Server has Tara has a great post on this. If you search for statistics explosion, Kendra
I do not. I was going to say, if you said Tara first, I'm like, I do not.
Looking right at
no
it.
such thing.
As you can see here, so Kendra years ago wrote a blog post about the secret I/O explosion. If you have 10 statistics on a table, SQL Server will scan the freaking table 10 times in order to update stats.
I did not know that.
I know, me neither, because I'm like, who creates that many statistics on a table? Robert says, I'm setting up a 2-node cluster on Win2012 R2. Do I need a heartbeat network, or does the virtual cluster adapter take care of this? When you were building clusters, did you build a separate heartbeat network?
I let my sysadmin take care of that kind of stuff. I worked in organizations that had Windows teams, Unix teams, SQL Server teams. We all had our role. I did the SQL Server installation after the sysadmin team had configured the cluster and done that stuff. So I know we had heartbeat IPs. I don't know what the virtual cluster adapter is. So.
A lot of people, you find the bigger that the company is, the more they start to, the Windows team will build clusters and then hand off the working cluster to the SQL Server team, with the understanding being that if the cluster service doesn't start, then it's a Windows problem. The Windows team troubleshoots it. It's hard for a SQL Server DBA to be good across the entire stack. I loved working in tiny companies where I got to do everything, but then I did a crappy job at everything.
Right, yeah.
And then to say I would never do a heartbeat adapter these days. In the days of 10 gig Ethernet, you just don't need separate throughput to dedicate. There are edge cases where you do if you're doing iSCSI and regular network traffic over the same stupid 10 gig adapter, then you can run into saturation, but that's fairly unusual. Colin says, I work with morons. Oh, you haven't come to work here yet. Who constantly write cursors and triggers. What can I do to get my coworkers to write good T-SQL? Well, I'll rephrase this differently. Are cursors and triggers bad?
They can be. It just depends. You know, is the database designed in such a bad way that cursors and triggers are needed? Triggers can be fine because it depends on how you're using them. You know, if you're using it so that you're protecting the integrity of the database and putting business logic into them, then that's a really valid point. If you're using triggers to do auditing, yes, that's good too, but that adds performance overhead. If you're using triggers to do all sorts of other work and just adding time to your transaction time, I don't like that. But cursors, it just depends on what is needed to complete the task. So maybe they're constantly having to write cursors because that's what the database design requires, and that means that the database design needs to change. But you know, there aren't the things that require cursors. But can the queries be rewritten to be set-based instead? Work with them and show them that this cursor can instead be rewritten to do this, and maybe they'll learn.
What I seem to find is that when someone resorts to it in one certain coding pattern, it's because it's what they know. It's just the way they've always seen it. So training usually makes a bigger difference. The other thing is sometimes they have a manager with a gun to the head saying you have to ship 15 features today. You know, it's got to get out, and so they're just trying to find the fastest, dirtiest ways to ship it. So no one wants to write crappy code other than me. I thoroughly enjoy it every time I get to do demos. The key word being that you work with morons. So you basically have two choices: either get the morons trained or go somewhere where you're not working with morons. Bad news, there are morons everywhere.
Everywhere, yeah.
John says, related to the unused index question, is it safer to disable an index instead of dropping it?
Sure, but I mean, disabling it does remove the space that it's using. All it does is it's keeping the index diff definition in place, so that if you decide to re-enable, rebuild an index so that it's now in place again, you don't have to go through email, through your scripts or your source control to figure out what that index definition is. I've actually never, I've never even disabled indexes. I just drop them when I don't need them, and I know that all of this stuff has been in source control because that's what we did at these companies.
I like disabling indexes only for one purpose. This is the only time I've ever done it. It was when I had a third-party vendor, and they were like, "You can't touch our indexes." I could disable their indexes, and they didn't know they were disabled because they still look like regular indexes in Object Explorer. Other than that, I drop them too. If I need to get rid of them, just drop them. I feel differently about tables. If I need to drop a table, I will rename it with like "to be deleted" at the end of the file name or at the end of the table name with a date. And we'll take one last question from Nestor. Nestor asks, have you ever encountered a performance problem due to auto-update statistics being set to on?
I actually have, and I didn't disable auto-update statistics on it. What I did instead is I made sure that my statistics were being updated, on with our own code, daily, multiple times per day, so that the auto-update statistics wouldn't kick in. I wanted it still enabled in case we weren't hitting a new table. At least that would kick in for that new table, for instance. But I believe that the issue was that the auto update statistics uses SP update stats, which uses the last, it uses a weird sample, and so our code did it, well, in our opinion, through testing, our code did a better decision on what the sample size should be. So we wanted our custom code to run usually.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for hanging out with us this week, and we will see you guys next week at office hours. Adios, everybody.